What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest. Let's take a look at the top decks to climb in Marvel Snap. First up is my current take on Loki, which is an Elsa Loki build. I consider this to be my most comfortable deck right now, although I will freely admit that I just have a ton of experience on Loki, and for that reason, I think it is entirely plausible that maybe I'm just a little bit more comfortable playing this than most other people are. It has been my most successful deck so far, 60% win rate, positive cube rate in the top 50. I have had a ton of success playing this, and I think the game plan should be pretty clear to you. You're not primarily a Loki deck. I'd actually say you're primarily an Elsa deck, but you get Collector Loki in your Elsa deck. Similar to some of the other lists that have hybridized Elsa in, like the Move Mid-Range deck or the Brood deck, this one is doing the same thing. It's just I think it's hybridizing with a much stronger core. Now, the reason I think this is a much stronger core is because of the extra room in the deck. The Brood deck and the Move deck are very, very full. You want to be optimizing for the synergy that you get in those lists. However, in Loki, you get a bunch of different tech slots that you can really play around with. And in this case, the inclusion of Luke Cage in addition to Mobius and Mobius makes us a deck that is generally immune to Shadow King a decent amount of the time. We have all of the upsides of many of the other decks. That we have the Kitty that can go in the Elsa lane. We have the ability to put a Jeff in the Elsa lane as well, get those extra buffs. We just have so much resilience to various pieces of RNG as well. Between Mobius invalidating Dream Dimension and making Elysium one-sided, Luke Cage turning Necrotia into an instant win, and Jeff, especially Elsa Jeff, becoming an absolutely game-winning threat on locations like Sanctum Sanctorum. The deck is not just a deck that does its own game plan, it's a deck that can really adapt to the locations in play, and a lot of locations that are normally negative for most decks are positive to neutral for this because of all the cards we get to run. Now, of course, there are still games where we just go, Snowguard, Collector, Loki, I'm out of here, right? Like, that's still going to happen. I do think that the existence of Mobius has made me less focused on Lokiing for as many cards as possible, because it's very often that we're not going to be able to play all of those cards, but understand that Lokiing for like 3 or 4 cards, when the 3 or 4 cards in your hand are not actually that good or that impactful, is usually going to be a plus EV play, especially if they don't have a Mobius. Just getting some cheap stuff to play, some good cards, is a very, very powerful play still. And of course, when they do have a Mobius, if you're matched up against, say, the Move Mid-Range deck, Collector Loki still trumps that deck, unfortunately for them. If you can do Collector Loki into, like, literally just some of their cards, most of their cards are very, very good against them as well, and you can just, play out the cards in their deck and win the entire game that way, even if they have a Mobius. I consider this the strongest Elsa deck that I've played so far. It has been a very successful list for me, but there are plenty of others. If you want more on this list, I did a video on it just very recently. The list has evolved a bit since then, but the concepts should remain the same. Next up is free-to-play Shuri, a deck I consider a true elite contender in Marvel Snap right now. You may notice there is a Mobius in here. I know, it's not purely free-to-play. I get it. But Mobius in here is a lot more replaceable than he is in a lot of his other lists. Like, you are pretty much fine doing whatever you want with that slot as long as it's something that you're happy to play early, as long as it's like a cheap card. You can replace it with, another 1-drop, whatever you really want to do there. Titania, anything you want, right? Like, whatever you want to do with that Mobius slot, you probably can. Right now, it might be a little bit contradictory to look at this and say, oh, well, he's playing Mobius in his Sauron deck? And the answer is yes, because after I play Sauron, I'm never going to want to play Mobius anyway. After I play Sauron, the card I want to play on 4 is Shuri. If I don't play Shuri on 4, I want to play Typhoid Mary on 4. It's very rare that I'll be like, yeah, I really don't want to play Sauron, so I can play Armor and Mobius on 4. However, on turn 2, you really do want to play one of Armor or Mobius. You really do want to get that down. And so I think that Mobius is just a fine inclusion here. Like, it's not the greatest card of all time, but it is a fine one. It is a lower priority inclusion here than it is in anything else, which is why I'm still calling this deck free-to-play Shuri, because I don't even really think you need it. He just kind of helps some of the time when you happen to draw, you know, Mobius into Sauron against a deck where Mobius is good, or on when you get like a Dream Dimension or whatever. If you really don't want to play Mobius, though, one other card that you should really consider is Luke Cage. Again, same thing. Why are you playing this Luke Cage card in your Sauron deck? And the answer is the same, because when you get it down on turn 2, it'll win you a bunch of games. Luke Cage is especially something that is like proactive against the things that are good against you, namely Shadow King, which is very prominent right now. And so if you wanted to just take the Mobius out, run Luke Cage, make this a pure free-to-play deck, I think that could arguably just be a better situation for you to be in. Right now, I have the Mobius in as a hedge against other like people who think Loki is the best deck like I do, or just generally just the locations that you really don't want to see, because stuff like Dream Dimension tends to really, really mess this deck up. So I think Mobius is like fairly important there, whereas, you know, the locations that Luke Cage prevents, like Necrotia, you're actually really good on those locations anyway. The real thing that Luke Cage would be doing is preventing you from being Shadow King. Next up is Broodstone, and I actually did a video on this list very, very recently, and it is just solidly powerful deck. It is where I'm at with this archetype currently. I have seen some people dropping either Patriot or Surfer, mostly Surfer, for an Iron Man in here. I think that's probably pretty smart, but I haven't tested it. So I'm just going to show you the list that I have actually tested. This list is, you might think it's built around Brood. It's not actually built around Brood so much. It's built around what is the best shell that we can play Elsa Vision into Alioth. Like, that is what this deck is trying to do as reliably as possible. And it turns out if you just go like Elsa, Brood, Absorbing Man, Vision, Alioth, that's actually quite powerful. And the obvious shell for something like that, the move mid-range shell, actually tends to have a poor matchup into this because this deck just does points a little bit better. Of course, when you're doing things like Forge, Brood, Absman, Vision, Alioth, you tend to have a lot of control over how the game plays out. It's an extremely powerful deck, but one of the lessons I did learn with it was you need to not get involved in high leverage situations as much as you can, because when you are involved in high leverage situations, this deck is extremely predictable. It wants to do basically one thing all the time, and it uses a lot of its board slots in order to accomplish putting a lot of power out. And because all the board slots are used, you have very limited options. Your opponent is much more easily able to reason out what you are attempting to do because you only have like one spot here, two spots here on the final turn of the game. They kind of know what's going on. They have a much easier time understanding what you're attempting to accomplish. The Vision and the Jeff help. They make you a little bit less predictable, but even when you're doing your nut draw, you are a little bit predictable. And that means that people are going to stay in on games where they know that they're doing something that beats what they think you're doing. You have some weaknesses to that. Move mid-range is a fine deck. I think it's like probably the baseline deck here where I think you need to go higher than this, but if you can't go higher than this, you aren't a real deck. Move mid-range is another deck built on Elsa, Jeff, Vision, Alioth. What we're really trying to do here is just put points onto the board. Vision with a bunch of power off of an Elsa into Alioth is an extremely powerful thing to do. And the rest of this deck is just good points. And it's very similar to the Broodstone deck in terms of how it looks like when it plays out, but it sacrifices a little bit of top-end power for more consistency. The Broodstone deck has a lot of high roll potential. Forge, Brood, Absman, extremely hard to beat. Like, that's still a 15-power Brood. That's pretty ridiculous, right, for turn 3. But this deck has a lot more replaceability. There's a lot of different 2-drops you can use to start scaling up. There's a lot of different plays you can make in this deck that all sort of result in the same thing, which is consistently putting a decent amount of points on the board and then hopefully finishing them off with an Alioth. What I do think, though, is that this deck's consistency comes at the cost of actual power. It is a rough sell into some of the other matchups that I've talked about here. It's a hard deck to get the most out of, and while there is value in consistency, I think Marvel Snap actually rewards a little bit of inconsistency the way the Snap system tends to work. I do think this deck is a fine choice, but it would not be my first choice if I were attempting to climb. When the card Alioth was first released, I assumed that the nerf to the Soul Stone on Thanos was done to prevent a deck like this from emerging, which is to say a deck that goes turn 4 Professor X, turn 5 Dino, turn 6 Alioth the Dino lane, the game is over, right? That is the exact kind of play pattern that this deck is built around. It was built by Johnson, an elite Korean player who's the top 8, the Impulse Pro Series. Another player top 8'd it with almost the exact same list named Mega Mawile. Then Swen picked it up. Then Torikun picked it up. A lot of really good players have really missed Thanos. And I don't know if this is, truly elite. I think that the Thanos weaknesses that it currently has are still quite prominent. And I think it's very hard to sell me on a deck like this into the Loki matchup, but the inclusion of Mobius does do a decent amount to help that out. It is the same Thanos deck you remember, but it's just a little bit weaker, and we're hoping that with our Mobius, we make everything else a little bit weaker as well. You have tools in a lot of matchups, but if you fall behind on the board, it's very hard to be an Alioth deck, and so you need to make sure that does not happen. You have a lot of power now, thanks to Elsa Bloodstone. This is yet another Elsa Vision Alioth deck. You're going to see that a lot. You already have seen that a lot. I think my question is, where does it stack up next to Move Midrange? Where does it stack up next to the Brood deck that is doing that thing? I don't actually 100% know. I do think I'd be doing you a disservice not to put this deck on this list because I know a lot of people are excited about it, but I'm still not 100% sold, so be prepared for me to make a huge my bad video if it turns out this deck is awesome. I'm going to be playing it a lot on stream later today. My preliminary testing with it is yeah, this is kind of what I expected, which is to say, if you haven't played against Thanos in a while, this might get you, but I don't exactly know the snap mechanics with it yet. I feel like we're maybe supposed to snap Mind Stones on one now, but now you snap Mind Stone on one, you draw Soul Stone, Power Stone, and your deck just clunks. There's a lot of awkward situations that are generated when you play this deck, and it feels to me that it's a little bit less consistent and a little bit less powerful than the other versions of Vision type Alioth decks, but it does have some unexpected wins in here. It is a deck that can really get people, and if you're good at taking those 50-50s, this is an absolutely 50-50 filled deck. There are so many just I need to know where they're going to play so I can Alioth it, or I need to know that this leader is going to win me the game kind of situations, right? There's a lot of power in this deck, a lot of unique situations that are created by playing this deck. And I do think that there's a certain type of player that is just going to love this, but I don't actually know exactly how good it is, exactly where it stacks up in the hierarchy of Vision Alioth decks. That said, I'm generally optimistic on this. I'm just worried that the fact that I love Thanos so much is making me a little bit too optimistic. So please do take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. I think the deck looks good. I think I really like it, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So I don't want to just run out ahead and be oh, this is so awesome. And then it turns into another 55% win rate Thanos deck. That said, the preliminary stats on it do seem pretty good for now. I don't, again, know how much of that is just the players who know about it are the good players. A lot of the people playing this deck are the people who either A, are Johnson, Swen, or Torikun, or B, follow Johnson, Swen, or Torikun, which you should, but not a lot of people do. And so it's a certain type of high investment player is the only kind of person playing this exact list right now. So we'll have to wait for it to disseminate to the wider player base before we get a real sense of how good it is. Now moving on into the honorable mentions category, Phoenix Force is a deck you still absolutely need to respect. I did a video on it pretty recently. I think a lot of people enjoyed me playing something a little bit less aggressively tier 1. But this is the build that I've been losing to the most, the one with Arnim Zola. And I think the Arnim Zola is pretty important here because it gives you, as weird as this sounds, a thing that Alioth players need to think about that makes them play a different play, right? So, like, let's say you have, like, a big Venom in one lane and you're actually just gonna, like, you know, drop a Chavez somewhere. Well, they have to be afraid of the Arnim Zola in the Venom lane, right? If you're within 9 on another lane, you can just play a Chavez there, and they're almost always gonna have to Alioth the Venom lane. And I think that juke specifically is quite important. Of course, there's other things that Zola lets you do. Like, if you're ahead, Zolaing and Nimrod is quite powerful. But I think specifically just having the option to, if they're going to Alioth another lane, you can Zola your Venom. And if they're going to Alioth the Venom lane, you can play a Chavez somewhere else. Like, specifically making them have to think about their Alioth more. And if they don't think, taking some free cubes is probably an incredibly important thing for me. Like, I am a big fan of that. Like, the Zola over the Taskmaster is to make people think about that, right? Like, that is the entire thing that it is trying to accomplish. I wouldn't be shocked if you wanted to play both. Another thing you'll notice is Deathlock is back in here, and that's because I hate the guy, but I hate having to choose more. I don't want to get punished for, like, blowing up a guy and playing to a top-decked Phoenix Force, and then it turns out that I don't draw the Phoenix Force, and I draw Nimrod, and I'm like, oh my god, why did I play that Deathlock? I only have a Carnage now for this Nimrod. I think that this is a fine build to play with, but I think, like, specifically those slots and Forge, if you wanted to mess around with stuff, would be the ones I would mess around with. I believe this is Spyro ZA's list. I am not 100% sure, so please let me know in the comments if you know that it is his list or is not his list. I think that it is, so shout out to Spyro. This is my current configuration of Elsa Bounceless Bounce, and I am generally a fan of just having a lot of power on the board and having my opponent not know where it goes. I do feel like this deck is especially vulnerable to Shadow King. The issue I have is the specific card that I would cut to get a loot cage in here is Iron Man, and I don't want to cut Iron Man. I like Iron Man. I like Bast Iron Man. I like doing that. Gives me some extra value off of the Bast, where if Luke Cage was in here, I'd start questioning if the Bast was even good. I genuinely think this is a very powerful deck. It is a deck that a ton of people have had a ton of success with. I don't know exactly if it's better than the Loki version. Personally, I prefer the Loki version, but I would be doing you a disservice to not talk about the Bounce version as well, especially with Iron Man in there. Iron Man is an extremely powerful card right now as a force multiplier. He makes lanes very, very difficult to win, and even when things get Shadow Kinged, Iron Man is still quite a powerful threat, even at his normal 5-0 cost. However, he is, you know, you put him in a bishop lane, the bishop gets Shadow Kinged, that's pretty tough to deal with. And so there is some consideration for getting a loot cage in here if you can. I do think Mobius is far more important. That said, there have been less waves recently, and if everyone just agrees to stop playing wave, maybe we can play loot cage instead of Mobius. I don't think we're there yet, but if you absolutely do not see wave, or if you're just comfortable being like, all right, fine, I'll lose to it, you could try the loot cage there. All right, y'all, that's going to be it from me. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You be good, and I will see you in the next one.